How's it going, everyone? It is me, the Lone Vault Wanderer, here with my somewhat weekly Borderlands 3 video, although it's becoming increasingly difficult to make videos on Borderlands 3 when there's no news or any rumors going around with regards to this game, but I digress. It's probably going to be happening at E3 this year, fingers crossed. But the inspiration for today's video comes from a YouTuber known as Morning After Kill. I will link his video in the description below for you to check it out. But essentially, he poses the question whether Borderlands 3 can overcome the hate of the pre-sequel. And that, of course, will be the question I also pose to you. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, whether Borderlands 3 can overcome the hate that was received because of the pre-sequel. I don't know if it was necessarily that much hate. Maybe it was somewhat neutrality with regards to that game. But nevertheless, let me know, first, what you think about the pre-sequel in general. And second of all, whether you think Borderlands 3 can overcome the hate with regards to that game. And I do encourage you check out Morning After Kill's video because it's an interesting discussion point that doesn't just pertain to Borderlands, but it pertains to any game franchise that has had a bad game that it's needed to overcome with a sequel or with the next game in terms of public perception, etc. And of course, the pre-sequel wasn't received too well by fans. Now, I do need to bear in mind right at the start of this video, I haven't really played the pre-sequel. I played the hell out of Borderlands 1. In fact, I'm replaying it now with a couple of people online. Nova and Teal'c, I'm talking about you. And I've also played the hell out of Borderlands 2. In fact, for each of those games, I got every single achievement, which is probably the most fun I've ever had in playing games with friends. So yes, I've played the hell out of both of those games, but after about, I think it was like 5 to 10 hours roughly into playing Borderlands the pre-sequel with my mate, him and I just lost interest, to be honest. It felt kind of dull. It wasn't bad in our opinion up until that point, but the point is, I haven't played the game sufficiently enough to say definitively whether it was good, bad, or just somewhat neutral, right? So I want to be answering this question from the perspective of someone that has played the original 2 games to death, but not necessarily the 3rd game. But I still think anyone can answer this question because, let's be real here, there has been a lot of game franchises in the past that have had bad games that have gone on with the sequels or with the games after that to be much more popular than ever before and to have much better games than ever before. Yes, fans in the games industry can be critical of a game when it doesn't deliver, especially when that franchise has had great games in the past and then it fails to deliver with a sequel. However, I'm sure that you'd all agree that people in the games industry can also be somewhat forgiving when a franchise has had a poor game that has gone on to improve significantly with the sequel. Fans tend to be forgiving in that regard. They seem to forget any bad games or somewhat average games that have happened in the past if the sequel or if the game after that does really well and improves upon the previous game in every single regard. And I've made my own list of games that I believe that I've played have done that relatively well, have removed themselves from the shackles of the previous games and gone on to appease and satisfy fans of that franchise that weren't happy with the previous game. And I think the exact same thing can happen with Borderlands the pre-sequel to Borderlands 3. So let me list some of those games, right? And I want to point out some obvious ones here, but let me know some examples in the comments below. What sequels of games are actually better than their predecessors that have changed your perception of that franchise entirely? So let's start with one of the obvious ones, Assassin's Creed. I recently replayed the first Assassin's Creed, and my god, as much as I love that game, and as nostalgic as I feel about that game and that franchise, the first Assassin's Creed game was very average. It was repetitive, you were doing the exact same thing in almost every area that you went to. In fact, you were revisiting several areas in that game, and it was rinse and repeat. You'd go to the Assassin's Creed Bureau, you'd tell the assassin there what Al-Mualim told you to do, you would do 2 or 3 fetch missions, like listening in on a conversation, like talking to a spy, etc. Very repetitive stuff. Then you'd kill your main target, report back to Al-Mualim, and you'd do the same thing like 9 times. That game was very, very repetitive. And as I'm sure many of you know, Assassin's Creed 2 was a phenomenal game, one of my favorite games of all time, and it absolutely improved on Assassin's Creed 1 in every single way. So that was one game that very much so, I think it's the most clear example out of the games that I'll mention in this video, of a game franchise improving a lot from a somewhat average or even maybe bad prequel or previous game to the sequel or to the game after that. And let's go to the next game, Super Mario Brothers, right? Super Mario Brothers 2 was a pretty average game. In fact, from what I remember, it was a reskin of a game that wasn't even Mario, and that's why there were so many different characters in that game. That's why it felt different to the previous Super Mario Bros. Game. And then came Super Mario Bros. 3, which absolutely killed it, right? It was an amazing game, one of the greatest games of all time. It's frequently listed in top lists in terms of the best games ever. And again, another game that had a crappy prequel, if you will, that improved significantly in the next game. And the last one that I'll mention is something that's particularly relevant, especially because we're talking about Borderlands 3 here. Borderlands 2 from Borderlands 1. Borderlands 1, as much as I love it, again, it was, you know what, I'm not going to say it was an average game, because I don't believe it was average, and I don't believe the direct comparison between Borderlands 1 and Pre-Sequel is fair at all. I would say that Borderlands 1 was a good game, and Borderlands 2 was a fantastic game. I think that's the best way to put it. Please don't hate me if you like Borderlands 1 better than Borderlands 2, but I think the overwhelming position on the internet, etc., and amongst fans is that Borderlands 2 was much better than Borderlands 1, and improved upon the formula in every single way, and that's why Borderlands 2 is frequently touted as the best Borderlands game to date. Arguably, it was really the game that got Borderlands onto the map, because it was just so much better than the original Borderlands. Again, I'm replaying Borderlands 1, and while it's good, while it's okay, it's certainly not as good as Borderlands 2, and I definitely think, no matter how much people hate or are neutral towards the pre-sequel, I certainly think that Borderlands 3, like any other sequel that has ever been made before, has the opportunity to overcome itself from any hate or any neutrality that was thrown towards the previous game. And also as well, Morning After Kill mentions this in his video, Borderlands pre-sequel wasn't made by Gearbox. It was made by 2K Australia, which is now shut down unfortunately, but it wasn't made by Gearbox. Now of course, it was still a Borderlands game, and it's still something that they need to address and improve upon, because for many Borderlands players I've talked to many Borderlands players about this and seen their comments, the pre-sequel left a bad taste in their mouth. And even though I didn't play that game enough to be able to say definitively whether the game was bad or just average, I've had experiences with so many different games that are sequels that have improved fundamentally upon their previous games and arguably put them on the map. And yes, one of those games was Borderlands. I can even mention another game, even though I don't think this game was bad, but Bioshock 2 to Bioshock Infinite. Bioshock 2 is another game that most fans or most people in the community don't believe was a great game. It was an average game in their opinion. I still think it was a really good game. But then Bioshock Infinite comes out and receives Game of the Year nominations. It just does so well. It tells an amazing story, and to many people was above and beyond Bioshock 2. Now, of course, in the comments, you're all probably going to discuss whether those previous games were as bad as the pre-sequel, and therefore those comparisons can't necessarily be made with Borderlands 3. But I still think the fundamental point applies. Any game franchise can overcome itself from the shadows of its past. So long as the next game that comes is good, fans in the games industry have proven themselves to be forgiving and to be able to let go of those bad tastes in their mouths that they may have of previous games and say, you know what? The developers did a great job here. I'm on board with this franchise again. And if Gearbox were to knock Borderlands 3 out of the park, I have absolutely no issues with saying that it could very well happen again. So anyways, Waysanders, please let me know your thoughts in relation to this question in the comments below. Again, please check out Morning After Kill's video, who was the inspiration for this video of mine. And until next time, this has been the Lone Vault Wanderer. Please take care of yourself, and would you kindly keep fighting the good fight.